The sound echoed like a gunshot through the mess hall at Naval Station Coronado. 300 sailors froze mid-bite, forks suspended in air, conversations dying so abruptly you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. General Marcus Thornfield's open palm had just connected with the face of a woman who looked like she didn't belong there at all. She stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds, head turned from the impact, auburn hair falling across her cheek. When she slowly faced forward again, her expression was unchanged. No tears, no shock, no anger, just patience, like someone waiting for a delayed flight that was finally about to board. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then dangerous. Because in that moment, every person in the room began to sense the same impossible truth. A woman who just got publicly humiliated by a 2-star general was looking at him like he was a child who had just made a very serious mistake. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Dr. Elena Vasquez had arrived at Naval Station Coronado exactly 48 hours earlier, stepping off a government transport in civilian clothes that suggested nothing more threatening than middle management. Navy blazer, simple white blouse, sensible flats. Her identification badge read Strategic Consultant in the kind of generic font that made people's eyes glaze over. She carried a single leather portfolio and a small overnight bag, moving through the security checkpoint with the unremarkable efficiency of someone accustomed to military bureaucracy. The base personnel officer who processed her paperwork barely looked up. Another contractor, another temporary assignment, another face that would disappear into the endless rotation of civilians who came to observe, analyze, and report back to Washington. Her clearance level was listed as standard administrative, her duration of stay marked as indefinite pending project completion, her purpose classified under the broad umbrella of operational assessment. Nothing about Elena Vasquez suggested she was anything more than what her paperwork claimed. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, spoke in measured tones that never rose above conversation level, and had the kind of forgettable features that helped her blend into any crowd. Her handshake was firm but not memorable, her smile polite but not warm, her questions precise but never probing. What the personnel officer didn't notice was the way she unconsciously scanned every room she entered, cataloging exits and sight lines with the automatic precision of someone trained to survive in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. He didn't catch the slight hesitation in her step when she passed the display case containing unit citations from recent deployments, or the way her fingers briefly tightened on her portfolio when she heard the distant sound of aircraft engines spinning up on the flight line. Her temporary quarters were in the civilian housing block, a small efficiency apartment with government-issue furniture and a window overlooking the enlisted parking lot. She unpacked methodically, laptop, a few changes of clothes, toiletries, and a small framed photograph of herself with 3 other women in military dress uniforms, their faces too distant to make out clearly. The photo went face down in the desk drawer beneath a stack of blank legal pads. That first evening, Elena walked the perimeter of the base alone, ostensibly familiarizing herself with the layout for her consultation work. She moved at the pace of someone getting exercise, not someone conducting reconnaissance, but her route took her past every major facility: the communications center, the armory, the administrative headquarters, and most importantly, the secure hangar complex where the air wing kept their most sensitive aircraft. She paused at the chain-link fence separating the main base from the restricted flight operations area, watching as maintenance crews worked under floodlights to service a row of FA-18 Super Hornets. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders squaring, spine straightening, chin lifting by degrees so small that only someone trained to read body language would have noticed. A young sailor walking past with his girlfriend glanced over and saw nothing more than a middle-aged woman in civilian clothes looking at airplanes like any tourist might. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked the specific maintenance procedures being performed on the aircraft, or how her fingers unconsciously moved in the pattern of a pre-flight checklist she'd performed thousands of times before. Elena completed her circuit of the base and returned to her quarters, where she spent 3 hours reviewing personnel files on her laptop. The files were comprehensive but not classified: service records, performance evaluations, assignment histories. She paid particular attention to the command structure, mapping relationships and identifying key influencers within the base hierarchy. One name appeared repeatedly in commendations and incident reports: General Marcus Thornfield, recently assigned as the base's senior Marine liaison, a position created to improve coordination between Navy aviation and Marine ground operations. His record painted the picture of an old-school warrior, decorated in 3 combat theaters, respected by his Marines, and known for his unwavering belief that standards should never be compromised for the sake of political correctness. Elena studied his photograph, a hard face carved from granite, steel-gray eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and forgiven too little. According to his file, General Thornfield had strong opinions about women in combat roles, opinions that had put him at odds with current Pentagon directives on gender integration. His comments during a recent Senate hearing had been quoted in Military Times. "Courage isn't about proving you belong. It's about proving you can keep others alive when everything goes to hell." She closed the file and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Outside her window, the base was settling into its nighttime rhythm. Security patrols making their rounds, duty personnel manning essential stations, aircraft positioned and secured for the next day's operations. It was a routine she knew intimately, a rhythm that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Elena opened her laptop again and composed a brief encrypted message to a secure server. "Initial assessment underway. Primary subject identified. Timeline remains flexible pending developments." She sent the message through 3 separate proxy servers before closing the program and shutting down the computer. Before going to sleep, she stood at her window one last time, looking out at the lights of the base. Somewhere in those buildings were answers to questions that had been burning inside her for 3 years. Questions about a mission that went wrong, about friends who never came home, about decisions made in boardrooms that cost lives on runways. She'd been patient for 3 years, building a new identity, establishing credentials, working her way into positions where she could observe without being observed. Now, she was finally close enough to touch the truth, close enough to find the people responsible for what happened to Strike Team Phoenix. Elena pulled the curtains closed and began her evening routine, checking the door locks, positioning her shoes for quick exit, setting her phone to vibrate only. Old habits from a life she was supposed to have left behind, habits that had kept her alive long enough to reach this moment. Tomorrow, she would begin her real work. Tomorrow, she would start asking the kind of questions that made important people uncomfortable. And if General Marcus Thornfield was as uncompromising as his record suggested, tomorrow would be the beginning of a confrontation that had been 3 years in the making. What Elena didn't know was that General Thornfield had already been asking questions about her. Her arrival hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone, and the Marine Corps had its own way of identifying threats before they became problems. The quiet woman with the forgettable face had a shadow that extended much further than her paperwork suggested, and shadows had a way of revealing themselves in the most unexpected moments. The stage was set for a collision between 2 people who believed they understood how power worked, who thought they knew the rules of the game they were playing. Only one of them was right. The morning of Day 3 began with the kind of California sunshine that made Naval Station Coronado look like a postcard, but Elena Vasquez could feel the tension building in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. She'd spent the previous evening in the officers' club, nursing a single glass of wine while listening to conversations that weren't meant for civilian ears. The talk had centered around General Thornfield's growing frustration with what he called the erosion of standards. 3 different officers had mentioned his recent confrontations with Pentagon directives, his vocal opposition to new integration policies, and his belief that the military was being weakened by political correctness. One captain had whispered that Thornfield was looking for a fight, and he didn't much care who gave it to him. Elena arrived at the mess hall at 07:30. The same time as always, carrying her breakfast tray to the small table near the windows where she'd established her routine. The morning crowd was different from dinner, more hurried, more focused, sailors and Marines grabbing quick meals before the day's operations began. She sat alone, as usual, reviewing notes on her tablet while methodically eating her scrambled eggs and toast. She didn't notice General Thornfield's arrival until his voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. "Attention on deck." The command wasn't regulation. This was a mess hall, not a formal ceremony, but it carried the kind of authority that made 300 people respond instinctively. Conversations died. Chairs scraped as personnel half rose from their seats. The room fell into an uncomfortable quasi-attention that acknowledged Thornfield's rank while questioning his purpose. Elena looked up from her tablet, taking in the scene with the analytical detachment she'd cultivated over years of observation. Thornfield stood near the entrance, dress blue uniform immaculate, silver stars gleaming on his collar. He was accompanied by 2 Marine captains who looked distinctly uncomfortable with whatever was about to happen. "As you were," Thornfield said, but nobody relaxed. His eyes swept the room with predatory precision, cataloging faces, assessing loyalty, identifying potential problems. When his gaze found Elena, it stopped. She met his stare calmly, the same way she'd met every challenge for the past 3 years. Nothing in her expression suggested she understood the significance of this moment. Nothing indicated she was anything more than a civilian contractor caught in an unexpected military formality. Thornfield began walking toward her table. Each step echoed off the linoleum floor with deliberate emphasis, boots striking in perfect rhythm, the sound designed to draw attention and build tension. Elena continued eating, but her peripheral vision tracked every person in the room, every exit, every potential ally or threat. Old training never fully disappeared, no matter how deeply it was buried. "Dr. Vasquez," Thornfield's voice carried across the silent room as he approached. "I understand you're here conducting some kind of assessment." Elena finished chewing, set down her fork with precise care, and looked up at the general. "That's correct, General. Operational efficiency evaluation for the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, supported by perfectly reasonable paperwork, delivered in a perfectly reasonable tone. But something about it made Thornfield's jaw tighten. "Operational efficiency," he repeated, making the words sound like an accusation. "And what, exactly, qualifies a civilian contractor to assess the efficiency of a naval air station?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Elena felt every eye in the room focused on their table, 300 people waiting to see how she would handle being challenged by a general officer. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the confrontation that would either advance her mission or destroy it completely. "I have a doctorate in organizational psychology from Georgetown," she replied evenly. 12 years of experience consulting for military installations, security clearance appropriate to the assessment scope, the same qualifications that have made my reports valuable to your superiors at the Pentagon. The last sentence was delivered with just enough emphasis to remind Thornfield that questioning her presence meant questioning the judgment of officers who outranked him. It was a subtle power play, the kind that worked in boardrooms and congressional hearing rooms. But General Marcus Thornfield wasn't a boardroom warrior. He was a Marine who'd earned his stars in places where subtle power plays got people killed. "Your superiors," he said, voice dropping to a register that made nearby conversations falter. "Let me tell you something about superiors, Doctor. I've been following orders from desk jockeys and political appointees for 30 years. I've watched good Marines die because some bureaucrat in Washington thought they understood warfare better than the people actually fighting it." Elena felt the temperature in the room drop perceptibly. This wasn't about her assessment anymore. This was about something deeper, something that had been building in Thornfield for years. "General," she said carefully, "I'm just here to observe and report. I'm not making policy decisions." "No, you're just gathering information that other people will use to make those decisions." Thornfield's hands were clasped behind his back, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained energy of a man who'd spent too many years watching what he loved being slowly dismantled. Information about whether our standards are too high, whether our training is too demanding, whether we're being unfair to people who can't quite measure up. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." The accusation in his words was clear. Elena was here to find excuses for lowering standards, to provide academic cover for political decisions that would weaken the military. In Thornfield's worldview, she represented everything that was wrong with the modern Pentagon: bureaucrats and consultants who'd never worn the uniform trying to fix problems they didn't understand. "I think you're mischaracterizing my work, General," Elena replied, maintaining her calm tone despite the growing hostility radiating from Thornfield and spreading through the room like a contagion. "I'm here to assess efficiency, not to recommend changes to training standards or operational procedures." Efficiency. Thornfield spoke the word like it tasted bitter. "You want to know about efficiency? I'll tell you about efficiency. Efficiency is having Marines who don't need their hands held through every operation. Efficiency is maintaining standards that ensure the person next to you won't crack under pressure. Efficiency is not pretending that everyone can do everything just because it makes the politicians feel good." Elena realized that this confrontation was about more than her presence on the base. Thornfield was using her as a proxy target for every frustration he'd accumulated over years of watching the military change in ways he couldn't accept. She was safe to attack because she was civilian, unprotected by rank or regulation, a perfect outlet for anger that had nowhere else to go. The smart play would be to de-escalate, to apologize for any misunderstanding, to retreat gracefully and find another way to gather the information she needed. Elena had played the smart game for 3 years, swallowing her pride, accepting disrespect, hiding her true capabilities to maintain her cover. But as she looked into Thornfield's cold gray eyes, she saw something that made her blood pressure spike. The same arrogant certainty she'd seen in the faces of the officers who'd sent Strike Team Phoenix into a mission they knew was compromised. The same dismissive attitude toward anyone who threatened their worldview. The same willingness to sacrifice others to protect their own power. "You're absolutely right, General," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge that made several nearby sailors glance up from their meals. "Standards are important. The question is whether we're maintaining the right standards for the right reasons." Thornfield's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Elena set down her coffee cup and looked directly at him. "Meaning that sometimes the people who talk the loudest about maintaining standards are the ones who've forgotten what those standards are actually supposed to accomplish." The words hit Thornfield like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and Elena could see the moment when his carefully maintained military bearing cracked under the weight of his anger. "Stand up," he ordered, voice carrying across the silent mess hall like the crack of a whip. Elena remained seated. "I beg your pardon?" "I said stand up. When a general officer is addressing you, you show the proper respect." "General, I'm a civilian contractor. I'm not subject to—" "Stand up!" The roar echoed off the walls, and Elena felt the collective intake of breath from 300 witnesses. This had escalated beyond professional disagreement into something personal and dangerous. Thornfield's authority was being challenged, and he was responding with the kind of overwhelming force that had served him well in combat zones, but was completely inappropriate in a mess hall. Elena stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "General, I think we should continue this conversation in private." "No, we'll continue it right here, in front of all these people who need to understand what respect looks like." Thornfield stepped closer, invading her personal space with the calculated aggression of a predator establishing dominance. "You come onto my base, question my Marine standards, hide behind your civilian status when confronted, and then have the audacity to lecture me about what standards are supposed to accomplish?" Elena felt something shifting inside her, a cold fury that had been building for 3 years, finally reaching critical mass. This wasn't about maintaining cover anymore. This wasn't about gathering intelligence or building cases. This was about a bully in uniform abusing his authority to humiliate someone he thought was helpless. "General," she said quietly, "I respectfully suggest you take a step back." The suggestion was delivered in the same measured tone she'd used throughout their conversation, but something in her posture had changed. Her feet had shifted slightly, weight moving to the balls of her feet. Her hands had moved from resting on the table to hanging loose at her sides. minute adjustments that would have been invisible to most observers, but screamed warning signals to anyone with combat training. Thornfield wasn't paying attention to warning signals. He was focused on the challenge to his authority, the public questioning of his judgment, the humiliation of being contradicted by a civilian woman in front of his Marines. "I'm not going anywhere," he snarled. "You want to question standards? Let me show you what real standards look like." His hand moved toward her face in what was probably intended as a dismissive gesture, a physical punctuation to his verbal dominance. But Elena saw it coming with the hyper-aware clarity of someone whose survival had once depended on reading such movements correctly. And in that moment, 3 years of careful planning, patient infiltration, and methodical investigation collapsed into a single instant of pure instinct. The slap never landed. Elena's hand moved with surgical precision, intercepting Thornfield's wrist 6 inches from her face. Her grip was firm but not crushing, her stance balanced but not threatening. To most observers, it looked like a simple defensive reflex, a civilian protecting herself from an aggressive superior. But Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, sitting 3 tables away, recognized something that made her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. The grip Elena used wasn't civilian self-defense. It was a textbook risk control technique from advanced close-quarters combat training, executed with the kind of unconscious precision that only came from years of practice. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Thornfield's senior aide, saw the way Elena's body had repositioned itself during the interception. Feet apart for stability, center of gravity lowered, spine straight. It was a combat-ready stance disguised as a defensive posture, and Rodriguez had seen it before in special operations personnel who'd learned to fight in places where losing meant dying. "General," Elena said calmly, still holding his wrist in her precise grip, "I need you to take a breath and step back." The mess hall had gone silent in a way that transcended mere quiet. This was the silence of 300 people witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen, something that challenged the fundamental order of military hierarchy. A civilian contractor had just physically stopped a 2-star general from striking her, and she'd done it with a level of calm competence that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd had to defend herself. Thornfield's face was cycling through shades of red that suggested his blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. The physical contact, the public restraint, the complete absence of fear or deference in Elena's demeanor. It was everything his worldview said was impossible. Civilians didn't stop generals. Women didn't control situations through physical means. Contractors didn't look at Marine officers like they were misbehaving children who needed correction. "Release my hand," he said through gritted teeth. "Immediately." Elena studied his face for a moment, assessing his emotional state with the clinical detachment of someone trained to evaluate threats. What she saw there wasn't just anger. It was the dangerous rage of a person whose fundamental beliefs about power and authority were being challenged in the most public way possible. "Of course, General," she said, releasing his wrist with the same controlled movement she'd used to stop his swing. "I apologize if my reflexes seemed inappropriate. Old habits." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fired round. Old habits. What kind of civilian contractor had old habits that involved intercepting strikes from general officers with textbook precision? Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park, the base's intelligence officer, felt something click into place in her mind. She'd been reviewing personnel files the night before, including the mysterious Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose credentials seemed both comprehensive and oddly vague. Park had noticed gaps in the timeline, periods where Elena's employment history showed consulting work for government agencies without specifying which agencies or what kind of work. Now, watching Elena maintain perfect composure while facing down an enraged general, Park began to suspect that those gaps weren't accidental omissions. They were deliberate redactions, the kind of careful editing that protected operational security for people whose real work couldn't be disclosed publicly. Thornfield was breathing hard, his face still flushed with anger and humiliation. The physical confrontation had ended, but the psychological battle was just beginning. He'd lost face in front of his Marines, been outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as insignificant. His authority had been challenged and found wanting, and everyone in the room had witnessed it. You have some interesting reflexes for an organizational psychologist, he said, his voice carrying a new edge of suspicion. Elena smoothed down her blazer and returned to her seat with movements that were precisely controlled but appeared casual. I've worked in some challenging environments, General. You learn to be aware of your surroundings. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation that explained nothing. Challenging environments could mean anything from inner-city consulting to overseas development work. But the way she'd handled Thornfield suggested experience with challenges that involved more than difficult clients or bureaucratic obstacles. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was studying Elena with the focused attention of a professional warrior who'd just witnessed something that didn't fit his understanding of the world. He'd served with special operations units in 3 different theaters, had trained with some of the most elite fighters in the military. The way Elena had controlled Thornfield's wrist, the stance she'd assumed, the calm way she'd managed a volatile situation, it all pointed to training that civilians simply didn't receive. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "if I may ask, what kind of challenging environments?" The question was delivered with military courtesy but carried undertones of professional curiosity. Rodriguez wasn't asking as a subordinate seeking information from a superior. He was asking as one warrior trying to identify another. Elena met his gaze steadily. Various locations. Sometimes you find yourself in situations where personal security becomes a concern. Another non-answer that revealed nothing while confirming everything. Rodriguez nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a coded transmission. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of operators who'd learned to survive in places where the official mission parameters didn't match the actual threat level. Chief Chen was having her own moment of recognition. The way Elena held herself, the way she'd responded to physical threat, the complete absence of panic or surprise when confronted by an aggressive superior. It all reminded Chen of her former commanding officer, a Navy SEAL who'd later transferred her to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The same controlled stillness, the same ability to project calm authority in chaotic situations. The recognition was spreading through the room like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Personnel who'd dismissed Elena as just another Pentagon bureaucrat were suddenly seeing her through different eyes, noticing details they'd overlooked, questioning assumptions they'd made about her background and capabilities. Thornfield felt the shift in the room's energy and realized that his attempt to humiliate a civilian contractor had somehow backfired spectacularly. Instead of demonstrating his authority, he'd revealed his own limitations. Instead of exposing Elena's weakness, he'd highlighted her strength. And now his Marines were looking at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright questioning of his judgment. "I think," Elena said calmly, gathering her tablet and coffee cup, "this might be a good time for me to return to my work. I appreciate the discussion, General. It's been very illuminating." She stood and walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. But now every person in the room was watching her movement, noting the way she carried herself, the way she navigated between tables without seeming to look, the way she maintained awareness of her surroundings while appearing completely relaxed. As Elena reached the exit, Master Sergeant Rodriguez called out, "Ma'am?" She turned, one eyebrow raised in polite inquiry. "Thank you for your service," he said simply. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Rodriguez wasn't thanking a civilian contractor for her consultation work. He was acknowledging a fellow service member, recognizing something in Elena that transcended rank, branch, or current assignment. Elena's carefully maintained civilian mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something that made several observers catch their breath. Pride, grief, determination, and a kind of weary strength that only came from carrying responsibilities that most people never imagined. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," she replied quietly. "It was an honor." And then she was gone, leaving behind a mess hall full of people who were beginning to understand that nothing about Dr. Elena Vasquez was what it appeared to be. Thornfield remained standing in the center of the room, surrounded by Marines and sailors who were looking at him with expressions he'd never seen before. Questions were forming in their minds, doubts about his judgment, concerns about his stability. The absolute authority he'd wielded for decades was cracking, and everyone could see the fractures spreading. The secure conference room in the base's intelligence wing hummed with electronic countermeasure equipment designed to prevent eavesdropping. But Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park wished it could also prevent the conversation she was about to have. The personnel file displayed on her encrypted terminal contained information that changed everything she thought she knew about the woman calling herself Dr. Elena Vasquez. Captain Michael Torres, the base's executive officer, sat across from her with his own terminal, displaying the same classified documents. His face had gone pale as he'd read through the redacted sections that had been unlocked by Park's security clearance upgrade request. "Jesus Christ," Torres whispered. "She's not a consultant." Park scrolled through pages of military service records that painted a picture so far removed from the quiet civilian they'd been hosting that it seemed like science fiction. Commander Elena Phoenix Vasquez, United States Navy, Naval Flight Officer, FA-18F Super Hornet, Strike Fighter Squadron 215, 3 combat deployments, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross. Her voice trailed off as she reached the final entry in Elena's service record. KIA, Operation Thunderstrike, Mediterranean Theater, classified location, body never recovered, posthumous promotion to commander. Torres leaned back in his chair, processing information that redefined every interaction they had witnessed over the past 3 days. She's supposed to be dead. Officially, she died 3 years ago when her Super Hornet was shot down during a classified mission in Syria, Park said, reading from the operational report. Her squadron was providing close air support for a joint special operations raid when they were ambushed by surface-to-air missiles. Intelligence suggested the enemy had advance warning of the mission. Torres was studying photographs attached to Elena's service jacket, images of her in flight gear, standing next to FA-18s, receiving commendations from Navy brass. The woman in these photos was the same person who'd been eating breakfast in their mess hall, but the context was so radically different that it felt like looking at an alternate reality. "Look at this," Park said, highlighting a section of the operational report. The mission was based on intelligence that proved to be compromised. 3 aircraft were lost, 8 aircrew killed or missing. Elena's plane went down behind enemy lines, but her body was never found. The assumption was that she'd been captured or killed by hostile forces. Torres felt a chill running down his spine. But she wasn't killed. She survived, and now she's here, investigating us under false identity. The question is why? Park pulled up another document, this one marked with security classifications that required 2-person verification to access. Operation Thunderstrike wasn't just compromised by bad intelligence. According to this investigation report, someone with access to operational planning deliberately leaked the mission parameters to enemy forces. The attack on Elena's squadron wasn't random, it was specifically targeted. The implications hit Torres like a physical blow. Elena hadn't died in the Mediterranean ambush, but she'd lost her squadron, her career, her identity. She'd spent 3 years building a new cover to investigate the betrayal that had killed her friends and nearly killed her. "She's hunting whoever sold out her mission," Torres said, "and she thinks the answer is here, on this base." Park was scrolling through personnel cross-references, looking for connections between current base staff and the compromised operation 3 years earlier. The search parameters were broad: anyone with intelligence access, anyone with connections to Syrian operations, anyone whose career had benefited from the classified information that had led to the ambush. One name kept appearing in the cross-reference reports: General Marcus Thornfield. "Torres, look at this," Park said, highlighting Thornfield's service record. 3 years ago, he was serving as intelligence liaison for Mediterranean Special Operations. He had access to operational planning for missions like Thunderstrike. And look at this. 6 months after Elena's squadron was destroyed, he received a promotion and transferred to a prestigious Pentagon assignment. Torres felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Elena's arrival at the base, her interest in operational efficiency, her calm response to Thornfield's aggression, it all made sense if she was investigating the general for treason. She's been playing him, Torres realized, getting close enough to gather evidence, watching him, building a case, and he has no idea who she really is. Park pulled up security footage from the mess hall confrontation, studying Elena's movements frame by frame. Now that she knew Elena's background, the signs were obvious: the combat-ready posture, the precise wrist control, the absolute calm under pressure. These weren't skills taught in graduate psychology programs. They were survival techniques learned in cockpits and combat zones. "We need to make a decision," Torres said. "Do we report this up the chain of command, or do we approach her directly?" It was a question that went to the heart of military loyalty and duty. Elena was operating under false credentials, conducting what amounted to an unauthorized investigation. By regulation, they should report her immediately to security personnel and let the system handle the situation. But Elena was also a decorated Navy officer investigating potential treason by a general officer. If Thornfield was indeed responsible for the intelligence leak that had killed her squadron, then exposing Elena's investigation could allow him to destroy evidence and escape accountability. Park made the decision. "We approach her directly. If she's really investigating Thornfield for treason, then she needs to know that people on this base are willing to help her." Torres nodded agreement, but carefully. "If we're wrong about this, if she's not who we think she is, then we're committing career suicide." As they began planning their approach to Elena, neither officer noticed the small recording device hidden in the conference room's ventilation system, or the fact that their entire conversation was being transmitted to a secure receiver in General Thornfield's private office. The hunter was about to discover that she had become the hunted. Elena Vasquez sat in her temporary quarters at 22:47 hours, encrypted laptop open on the small desk, reviewing 3 years of carefully gathered intelligence that was finally beginning to form a complete picture. Financial records traced through offshore accounts, communication intercepts decoded by NSA assets, personnel movement patterns that aligned perfectly with compromised operations, all of it pointing to the same conclusion she'd suspected since the day her Super Hornet had been shot out of the Syrian sky. General Marcus Thornfield wasn't just a bully with outdated views on military standards. He was the traitor who had sold Strike Team Phoenix to enemy forces for $2 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. The evidence was overwhelming, but Elena knew that overwhelming wasn't the same as actionable. Thornfield had been careful, using cutouts and intermediaries, hiding his betrayals behind legitimate intelligence-sharing protocols. The kind of evidence that would satisfy a military tribunal required more than financial forensics and communication analysis. It required testimony from someone with direct knowledge of his crimes. A soft knock at her door interrupted her analysis. Elena closed the laptop immediately, checking the wall clock, nearly 2,300 hours, well past normal visiting hours. Her hand moved instinctively toward the concealed pistol in her overnight bag before she caught herself. 3 years of civilian cover had trained her to think like a consultant, not a combat officer. "Who is it?" she called softly. "Lieutenant Commander Park, ma'am. I need to speak with you about something urgent." Elena recognized the voice from the base intelligence office. Park had been one of the few personnel who'd treated her with professional courtesy, rather than the dismissive tolerance most officers showed civilian contractors. But an intelligence officer arriving at her quarters after hours suggested that her cover might be compromised. Elena opened the door, noting that Park was in civilian clothes, but carrying herself with the alert posture of someone prepared for trouble. Behind her stood Captain Torres, also in civvies, also displaying the controlled tension of officers operating outside normal protocols. "Commander Vasquez," Park said quietly, using Elena's real rank for the first time since her arrival. "We need to talk." The use of her true identity hit Elena like a physical blow, but her expression remained neutral. 3 years of deep cover work had taught her never to confirm suspicions, even when the game was clearly over. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion," Elena replied calmly. "I'm Dr. Vasquez, strategic. Consultant. I'm not sure what—" "Phoenix," Torres said softly. Your call sign was Phoenix." Elena's carefully maintained civilian mask cracked for just an instant, revealing the grief and determination that had driven her for 3 years. The call sign wasn't in any unclassified record. These officers had accessed her complete military file, which meant they knew everything: her real mission, her true identity, the reason she was hunting Thornfield. She stepped back, allowing them to enter her quarters. "How long have you known?" "Since this afternoon," Park said, closing the door behind her. After what happened in the mess hall, I pulled your file. The real one, not the consultant cover story. Elena moved to the window, checking the parking lot below for surveillance vehicles or unusual activity. Old habits from a life spent in places where exposure meant death. Then you know why I'm here. We know about Operation Thunderstrike, Torres said. We know about the intelligence leak that got your squadron killed, and we know that General Thornfield had access to the operational parameters that were compromised. Elena turned back to face them, studying their expressions with the analytical precision of someone whose survival had depended on reading people correctly. What she saw wasn't accusation or hostility. It was understanding, and something that looked like determination to help. "What do you want?" Elena asked. "We want to help you finish what you started," Park replied. "But first we need to warn you. Thornfield knows." The words hit Elena like ice water. "What do you mean he knows?" Torres pulled out his phone, showing her a text message received 20 minutes earlier. "Conference room C, building 7, now come alone, MT." "He's demanding a meeting," Torres explained, "but Jessica and I were monitored during our conversation this afternoon. He heard everything. Your real identity, your mission, the evidence you've gathered." Elena processed this information with the rapid threat assessment that had once kept her alive in hostile airspace. Thornfield knew she was Phoenix, knew she was investigating him, knew his secrets were about to be exposed. A cornered traitor with general stars was exponentially more dangerous than an angry bully. "He's going to try to eliminate the threat," Elena said, "either by discrediting my investigation or by ensuring I can't testify." Park nodded grimly. "That's what we think. But Elena, you don't have to face him alone. We have people on this base who will stand with you." Elena looked at these two officers, strangers 48 hours ago, now willing to risk their careers to support her mission. It was a level of trust she hadn't experienced since losing her squadron, a reminder of what military service was supposed to mean. "If I go to this meeting, if I confront him directly, there's no going back," Elena said. "Once the truth comes out, everything changes. Your careers, this base, the investigation. All of it becomes public." "Commander," Torres said formally, "some things are more important than careers. Those 8 aircrew who died in Thunderstrike deserve justice. The soldiers who might die in future operations if Thornfield isn't stopped deserve protection." Elena felt something shifting inside her, a weight she'd carried for 3 years beginning to redistribute. She'd been hunting alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have allies, to be part of something larger than her personal quest for vengeance. "All right," she said finally. "Let's end this." The walk to Building 7 took place in a silence that felt like the calm before an artillery barrage. Elena moved with the measured pace of someone walking to execution, but her mind was running through tactical assessments and contingency plans. Torres and Park flanked her at regulation distance, their presence both protective and symbolic. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Personnel who'd witnessed the mess hall confrontation had shared their observations with friends, who'd shared them with their supervisors, who'd begun asking questions about the mysterious Dr. Vasquez, who'd handled a general like a trained operator. As they passed the enlisted quarters, Elena noticed faces at windows, personnel who should have been off-duty gathering in small groups, conversations that stopped when she approached but resumed with increased urgency after she passed. The base was holding its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Master Sergeant Rodriguez appeared from between 2 buildings, falling into step beside Torres without being asked. Then Chief Chen emerged from the communications building, joining the informal escort. Lieutenant Commander Walsh from the Air Wing, Petty Officer First Class Morrison from Intelligence, Hospital Corpsman Martinez from Medical, one by one, personnel materialized from the shadows and added themselves to Elena's procession. By the time they reached Building 7, Elena found herself accompanied by 27 officers and enlisted personnel representing every major department on the base. No one had organized this gathering, no orders had been issued, no formal structure had been established. But word had somehow spread that Phoenix was walking to confront the man who'd betrayed her squadron, and good sailors and Marines had decided that she wouldn't walk alone. Building 7 was the base's administrative headquarters, a three-story structure that housed senior staff offices and secure conference rooms. At this hour, it should have been nearly empty except for essential duty personnel. Instead, lights blazed from every window, and Elena could see silhouettes moving through the corridors, more personnel gathering to witness whatever was about to unfold. As Elena's group approached the main entrance, the doors opened to reveal Master Chief Petty Officer Susan Roberts, the senior enlisted leader for the entire base. Roberts was a legend in her own right, 32 years of service, combat veteran of 4 different theaters, the kind of leader who commanded instant respect from admiral and seaman alike. "Commander," Roberts said formally, coming to attention as Elena approached. Elena stopped, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just military courtesy, but acknowledgement of her true rank and identity. The civilian cover that had protected her for 3 years was officially dead, burned away by the truth that could no longer be contained. "Master Chief," Elena replied, returning the salute with the precision of someone who'd earned the right to give and receive such honors. "Ma'am," Roberts said, "the crew would like permission to accompany you." Elena looked past Roberts into the building's lobby, where she could see dozens more personnel assembled in formation. Sailors and Marines representing every rate and rank, united by something that transcended individual loyalties or chain of command politics. They knew who she was now, knew what she'd sacrificed, knew why she'd come. "This is my responsibility, Master Chief," Elena said quietly. "I won't ask others to risk their careers for my mission." "With respect, Commander," Roberts replied, "this stopped being just your mission the moment we learned the truth. General Thornfield betrayed every person who wears this uniform. We have a right to see him answer for it." Elena felt emotion threatening to overwhelm the careful control she'd maintained for 3 years. These people, most of them strangers until 48 hours ago, were offering to stand with her against a general officer, to risk everything in support of justice for fallen comrades they'd never known. "Master Chief," Elena said finally, "it would be an honor." Roberts smiled, the first genuine warmth Elena had seen from her, and stepped aside. "After you, Commander. Phoenix leads the way." Conference Room C occupied the top floor of Building 7, a secure space designed for classified briefings and sensitive discussions. Elena had been in rooms like this countless times during her active duty career, windowless chambers where the fate of missions and lives was decided by people who would never personally face the consequences of their choices. Tonight, the room felt different. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. General Marcus Thornfield sat at the head of the conference table in full-dress uniform, his silver stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. 2 Marine captains flanked him, his personal security detail, Elena realized, positioned to provide protection or enforcement as the situation demanded. Their hands rested casually near their sidearms, a subtle but unmistakable threat display. Elena entered alone, having left her escort of base personnel in the corridor outside. This confrontation needed to be between the 2 people who understood what had really happened over the Mediterranean 3 years ago, the traitor and the survivor. "Commander Elena Phoenix Vasquez," Thornfield said as she closed the door behind her. "I was wondering when you'd finally drop the consultant charade." Elena took the chair directly across from him, maintaining eye contact with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced down enemy fighters in air-to-air combat. "General, I assume you have something you'd like to discuss." Thornfield leaned back in his chair, projecting the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. "I want to discuss your unauthorized investigation, your falsified credentials, and your apparent belief that you can operate on my base under false pretenses without consequences." "I want to discuss Operation Thunderstrike," Elena replied calmly. "Specifically, how enemy forces obtained advance warning that allowed them to position surface-to-air missiles along our exact flight path." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. Thornfield's confident facade flickered for just an instant, revealing something that looked like genuine surprise that she'd cut straight to the heart of his crimes. "Operation Thunderstrike was compromised by enemy intelligence gathering," Thornfield said carefully. "The investigation concluded that hostile forces had developed sophisticated surveillance capabilities that allowed them to predict our operational patterns." "The investigation concluded what you needed it to conclude," Elena corrected. But I've spent 3 years gathering evidence that tells a different story. A story about classified operational parameters being transmitted to cutout accounts, about cryptocurrency payments traced to offshore shell companies, about a Marine general who sold American lives for personal profit. Thornfield's face hardened, but Elena could see calculation in his eyes, not the rage of an innocent man being falsely accused, but the cold assessment of someone determining how much his accuser actually knew. "You have evidence of nothing," he said finally. "Financial records can be fabricated, communications can be spoofed, and the testimony of a dead woman carries no weight in any tribunal." The phrase, "dead woman," hit Elena like a physical blow, but not because it hurt, because it confirmed everything she'd suspected about Thornfield's plans for tonight. "Is that your solution?" Elena asked quietly. "Another convenient death? Another operational casualty that eliminates an inconvenient witness?" Thornfield smiled, and the expression was cold enough to freeze blood. "Commander, you died 3 years ago over the Mediterranean. Your memorial service was beautiful. Full military honors, flag-draped coffin, the works. It would be tragic if the truth came out that you'd actually survived, only to die in some accident here on the base." Elena felt the weight of the concealed pistol under her jacket, but she also knew that Thornfield's Marines were equally armed and better positioned. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved through firepower. It required a different kind of weapon. "Before you make any irreversible decisions, General, there's something you should know," Elena said, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket. "I didn't come here alone." She placed a small recording device on the table between them, its red light blinking steadily. "This conversation is being transmitted in real time to the FBI, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and the Pentagon Inspector General's office," Elena continued. "They've been monitoring your communications for the past 6 months, building a case based on evidence I've provided. Your confession tonight was the final piece they needed." Thornfield's face went white as the implications hit him. His eyes darted to his Marine escorts, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they might be witnessing their commanding officer's admission to treason. "You're bluffing," Thornfield said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena pulled out her phone, showing him an active connection to a secure conference call with multiple participants. The screen displayed names and titles that made Thornfield's blood pressure spike. Director Richards, FBI Counterintelligence; Agent Morrison, NCIS; Colonel Hayes, Pentagon IG. "General Thornfield," a voice from the phone speaker said calmly. "This is Director Richards. We've been listening to your conversation, and I need to inform you that you're under federal investigation for treason, conspiracy, and murder. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning continued, but Thornfield had stopped listening. His world was collapsing around him with the sudden violence of an artillery strike, and there was nowhere to run, no way to fight back, no strategy that could save him from the consequences of his choices. One of his Marine escorts stepped forward, hand moving toward his weapon, but Elena raised a palm to stop him. "Captain, your general has been selling classified information to enemy forces for 3 years," she said calmly. "He's responsible for the deaths of 8 American aircrew and countless soldiers who died in operations that were compromised by his betrayals. You don't want to add obstruction of justice to whatever charges you might face for following his orders." The Marine captain looked from Elena to Thornfield, confusion and disgust warring in his expression. These were men who'd followed the general into combat, who'd trusted him with their lives, who'd believed in his leadership. Learning that he was a traitor felt like discovering that gravity had suddenly reversed direction. "General," the captain said quietly, "is this true?" Thornfield looked at the faces around him, his own Marines staring at him with dawning horror, Elena watching him with the patience of someone who'd waited 3 years for this moment, voices from the phone continuing to detail the evidence against him. The trap was perfect, inescapable, and entirely of his own making. "It's true," he whispered, the words barely audible. The confession hit the room like a sonic boom. The Marine captains stepped back instinctively, distancing themselves from contamination. Elena felt 3 years of rage and grief and determination finally reaching resolution. justice arriving like artillery support after a long, desperate battle. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious about the answer. Thornfield looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster or a traitor, but as a broken man who'd made choices that had destroyed everything he'd once claimed to value. "Because they told me the military was changing," he said, voice cracking with emotion. "Because I believed that standards were being lowered, that politics was more important than readiness, that people like you—" He gestured helplessly at Elena. "People like you were going to get real Marines killed with your diversity initiatives and social experiments." Elena stared at him, processing the terrible irony of his confession. "So you decided to get us killed first." "I thought I was protecting the Corps," Thornfield said, tears beginning to flow down his face. "I thought I was preserving something worth saving. But then Thunderstrike happened, and I realized I'd become the thing I was trying to fight." The door to the conference room opened, and federal agents in tactical gear entered with weapons drawn and arrest warrants ready. Elena stood and stepped aside as they surrounded Thornfield, cuffing him with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. As the agents led him away, Thornfield looked back at Elena one last time. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Elena watched him disappear down the corridor, feeling neither satisfaction nor vindication, only the profound exhaustion of someone who'd finally completed a mission that had cost her everything she'd once been. The base assembly hall at Naval Station Coronado held 1,200 personnel in formation, every sailor and Marine assigned to the facility standing at attention as Admiral Patricia Hawthorne took the podium. The three-star admiral commanded the Pacific Fleet Special Operations Forces, and her presence indicated that the events of the past week had attracted attention at the highest levels of naval command. Elena stood to the side of the platform in her dress blue uniform, the real one this time, complete with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career that had officially ended 3 years ago. The Navy Cross gleamed on her chest, along with the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, and campaign ribbons from 3 combat deployments. She was no longer Dr. Elena Vasquez, strategic consultant. She was Commander Elena Phoenix Vasquez, United States Navy, returned from the dead to set the record straight. 3 days ago, Admiral Hawthorne began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. This base was the scene of events that have reminded all of us why integrity must be the foundation of military service. Elena let her gaze drift across the assembled formation, seeing faces she'd come to know during her time under cover. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been the first to suspect she wasn't what she seemed. Chief Chen, who'd recognized combat training in her movements. Lieutenant Commander Park and Captain Torres, who'd risked their careers to help her complete her mission. The investigation into General Thornfield's crimes has revealed the scope of damage caused by his betrayals, Hawthorne continued. 17 separate operations were compromised over a 3-year period. 43 American service members died as a direct result of intelligence he sold to enemy forces. The financial cost of his treason exceeds $200 million, but the cost in blood and trust is incalculable. Elena thought about her squadron mates, friends who died in the Mediterranean because they'd trusted their chain of command to protect them. Captain Sarah Walsh, her radar intercept officer, who'd been with Elena in the cockpit when their Super Hornet was hit. Lieutenant Commander Mike Chen, who'd flown wing on her for 18 months and never came home from his final mission. Young Lieutenant Rodriguez, fresh out of flight school, who'd been shot down on his 3rd combat sortie. They'd never gotten the justice they deserved, but at least now they had acknowledgement of the truth. "Commander Vasquez," Admiral Hawthorne said, turning toward Elena, "would you please join me?" Elena walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who'd learned that some moments were too important to rush. The hall fell silent as she approached, 1,200 people focusing their complete attention on the woman who'd sacrificed her identity to hunt down a traitor. "Commander," Hawthorne said formally, "on behalf of the United States Navy and the American people, I want to express our gratitude for your service, your sacrifice, and your dedication to justice for your fallen comrades." The words were appreciated, but Elena had come to understand that gratitude wasn't what she'd been seeking. Justice wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about ensuring that the people responsible for betraying trust faced consequences and that the system learned from its failures. "Thank you, Admiral," Elena replied. "But I want to be clear about something. This investigation wasn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the people who wear this uniform can trust the people who lead them." Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "Which brings me to the reason for this formation. Commander Vasquez, effective immediately, you're being reinstated to active duty with promotion to the rank of captain. You've been assigned as the new base intelligence officer, with additional duties as head of the Pacific Fleet's new counterintelligence task force." Elena blinked in surprise. She'd expected debriefings, testimony, maybe a quiet reassignment to shore duty while the Navy figured out what to do with an officer who'd officially been dead for 3 years. She hadn't expected to be handed responsibility for preventing future betrayals. "Ma'am," Elena said carefully, "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for—" "Captain," Hawthorne interrupted, using Elena's new rank with emphasis, "you spent 3 years building a false identity, infiltrating a secure installation, and gathering evidence against a general officer without being detected. You demonstrated tactical patience, operational security, and investigative skills that our intelligence community desperately needs. The question isn't whether you're qualified for the position. It's whether you're willing to accept it." Elena looked out at the formation again, seeing faces that had become familiar during her time undercover. These people had been willing to support her mission once they understood what she was fighting for. They'd risked their careers to stand with her against corruption and betrayal. They deserved leadership that would protect them from threats both foreign and domestic. "I accept the assignment, Admiral," Elena said. The formation erupted in spontaneous applause, a sound that began with the officers who'd worked directly with Elena and spread through the ranks like wildfire. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't proper military bearing, and it didn't matter. Sometimes recognition demanded expression that transcended protocol. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward from the formation, coming to attention with parade ground precision. "Admiral," he said in a voice that carried across the hall, "the base personnel request permission to render honors to Captain Vasquez." It was an unusual request, but Hawthorne understood the significance. These people needed to acknowledge not just Elena's return to duty, but her 3-year sacrifice in pursuit of justice for fallen comrades. "Permission granted, Master Sergeant." Rodriguez saluted Elena with the precision of someone who'd been perfecting the gesture for 20 years. The movement was followed instantly by 1,200 other salutes, an entire base rendering honors to the woman who'd proven that some principles were worth any sacrifice to defend. Elena returned the salute, feeling weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried for 3 years. The mission was complete, justice had been served, and she was no longer alone. But as the formation began to disperse, Elena's mind was already moving forward to new challenges. Thornfield had been caught, but he'd only been one traitor among many. The network that had supported his crimes extended beyond a single general, and rooting out corruption would require the same patience, dedication, and attention to detail that had brought her this far. 6 months later, Captain Elena Vasquez sat in her office reviewing intelligence reports from across the Pacific Fleet. The Counterintelligence Task Force had identified 17 potential security risks, prevented 4 attempted intelligence breaches, and uncovered a spy ring operating out of Pearl Harbor. The work was methodical, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. A knock at her door interrupted her analysis. "Come in." Master Sergeant Rodriguez entered, carrying a folder marked with classification stamps that indicated something significant was developing. "Captain," he said, "we've got a problem. Intelligence intercepts suggest someone's been selling submarine patrol routes to Chinese assets. The pattern looks familiar." Elena took the folder, scanning the preliminary analysis with growing concern. The operational security failures, the timing of the information transfers, the sophisticated methods of avoiding detection. It all suggested that Thornfield's crimes had been part of a larger network that was still operational. "How familiar?" she asked. Rodriguez met her gaze with the steady expression of someone who'd learned to trust his instincts about threats to American forces. "Phoenix familiar," he said quietly. Elena felt the old familiar weight settling onto her shoulders, the responsibility of hunting shadows, of protecting people who might never know they'd been in danger, of carrying the burden of knowledge that some fights never truly ended. She opened her laptop and began composing a message to Admiral Hawthorne. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Master Sergeant," she said without looking up from her screen, "clear my schedule for the rest of the week. We have work to do. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget."